All right, Joe, can you hear me good? Excellent. Let me take a sip of water real quick. Okay, so today I will be defending Donald Trump's tax plan and saying that it's a brilliant move for the U.S. economy. So I don't say that this plan is perfect by any means, but I think it has some very good elements and it's exactly what we need right now in the current time. So I'm going to break it down bit by bit to what's in the entire plan, and we can discuss each topic itself. So to start, it lowers the corporate tax rate from 35% to 20%. And this is rather significant for a few reasons. So for one, the United States of America had the highest tax rate for corporations in the entire industrialized world. So bringing this down to 21% puts us right in the middle of the pack with these other countries. Also, America's next net exports are at the second worst they've ever been in our country's history. And we currently have a $500 billion trade imbalance. So naturally, having a corporate tax rate be lowered is going to help us in this aspect of fixing our trade imbalance issue. And then even if you look at our the 2016 GDP for the United States, 70% of it was consumer spending, with only 16% being investment spending. If you compare that to a country like China, that only has 46% being consumer spending compared to our 70%, while they have 25% investment spending. That's a non-sustainable problem because we're becoming more of a consumer type society, and then we should be investing into businesses, into infrastructure, and therefore having the corporate tax rate lowered from 35 to 20% will help in that aspect. And I'll pass it to you and let you respond to that.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. All right. So first thing about lowering the corporate tax rate, it puts us right in the middle. However, that's not going to spur on any job growth. It's not going to actually facilitate any of the changes that you want when it comes to net export and consumer spending. What that will do is bring back a little bit, but that is not, this is a modest, and I mean modest tax bracket, right? There's still taxing goods coming from foreign places into America. They're still taxing goods that leave America that come back, right? Unless they're part of like NAFTA or something like that. So again, you're not going to get the increase that you want. At maximum, this specific point alone may increase growth by 0.01% over a 10-year period. That is not a significant amount. Especially when we compare it to the deficit that's going to be gained by this and the crowding out of interest rates and stuff like that. So I'm still waiting on something that's going to be substantive enough that's going to move past the problems that we're going to gain through the increased debt. I'm going to pass it back to you.
So to start with this the debt, right? I guess we'll get that one that way. So this myth that it's going to be a cataclysmic inclusion to the debt is not really backed by any type of analysis that's been done. They did a congressional analysis when they were doing this bill that showed it would increase the debt by about $1 trillion over a 10-year period, is what they came up with. If you compare that to the $10 trillion we got during the 8 years during the Obama administration, that it's insignificant to add this $1 trillion over the course of 10 years. That's actually fairly par for the course overall. But and then we'll talk about spurring job growth. Okay, so I think you have to look at this historically, right? Because it's like with anything that's being proposed by government, especially tax related, you can look at the economic theory, and then you can look at how similar things have been implemented in the past. And if you look at both our net exports and our debt to GDP ratio in the past 100 years, the times where they were at their best were in the 1980s after the Reagan tax cuts and in the early 2000s after the Bush tax cuts. There's significant increases to our nominal GDP, and it's not because the debt's getting smaller. It's because we have these economic booms after we have such times where we have lower the tax cuts. Now I'll get into some of the other parts of the tax bill that I think are really great. So to start, the estate tax is cut in half, which the estate tax is basically evil. Because who does the estate tax affect, right? People that are dead, and it ransacks their coffin for 40% of their funds. But it goes beyond that, because if you, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but something called a living will, which basically you are willing your funds to your children or to who you want while you're still alive. And that is the loophole around the estate tax, is you just give them their money while they're still alive. And the fact that this tax specifically targets people that have unsuspected deaths or don't have the financial and legal knowledge to know what a living will is means it's simply like taxing mourning families that you die in a car crash or it's taxing the people that don't have the insight or can't afford to hire a lawyer to actually get them around this loophole, and therefore it should be eliminated just strictly from a moral standpoint. Um, and then the other one is you talk about adding to the deficit, how it's not warranted. Well, one of them is state taxes are no longer deductible. So if you live in California and you're a millionaire and you pay 10% for state taxes, you used to be able to deduct that towards your federal income tax. That is no longer the case, and therefore it will get more money out of the upper 1% in the upper class compared to the lower classes, which are actually going to see an increase in the amount of tax deductions they get overall. And I'll get to some more of those later, but I'll pass it back to you.
All right, so first and foremost, I'm going to start off with the state tax because I concede the death tax, whatever. I think it should be abolished as well. State tax deduction, that is a problem, right? So these rich and wealthy do not get to deduct from the taxes, right? You care about the middle class and you care about the lower class. I care about the upper class. The upper class needs a bigger cut on their taxes, not the lower class and not the middle class. If we look at the Laffer curve based on Harvard's last report, increasing the taxes to the lower class and the middle class is still within reason on the Laffer curve and will gain revenue. Now, with the top, we should cut that a little bit, and that's not happening. That's actually increasing based on this deduction that you just talked about. That will spur less growth. That's why a lot of the growth estimates are very modest. Next, I'm going to talk about some serious here. So the markets are not getting a rush to capital that come in pouring into the United States, and the dollar's basically done nothing, right? As it's moving towards passing, there is no legitimate bond market. There is no significant pops in real rates, which is consistent with the dollar story. And there's no big expected jolt to supply side growth expectations, and also very little movement in inflation break-even spreads. And to the point that inflation is now having trouble, we're getting ready to move to a different type of targeting mechanism, which I had argued before, because we're having so many problems with inflation, and that the Federal Reserve can only do so much when it comes to fiscal and monetary switch off. So with all this in mind, are we advancing a debt-funded tax cut at a time of near full employment, which will likely add at least $1 trillion to a net $10 trillion in cumulative deficits over the next decade, right? That's the problem. Again, we have to look at this. Of course, you're using the comparison of Obama for it, but that's a bad comparison. We need to look at Ike. We need to look at Calvin Coolidge. We need to look at other time periods that have had better growth in the United States. I think the Gilded Age. I think of Bill Clinton. I think of possibly Ronald Reagan. But those tax cuts are not the same as that we're getting now, because we're having tax cuts with cuts in spending, but we're not gaining that. We're still spending at significantly over what we should, and we're cutting taxes at the same time while running full employment or near full employment. There is no reason to do this. It's only going to cause the economy to grow hotter, which will then lead to a bigger bust when the business cycle has to do a recorrection. And that's why I think you should not vote for this plan.
So a few of the points you brought up. So on and you talked about that. So 10% is a little hefty. You said that the top needs to be taxed a little bit more. And that's generally what's going to happen. If you live in a state like California, sure, and you're the upper class, you're probably going to get screwed because they have absurdly high income tax in California. But in a state like Georgia or, South Carolina, North Carolina, your state income tax is rather insignificant. And if you compare that to also what's in this bill, which is the narrowing of the tax brackets, you're only going to pay about an average of 2 to 3% more if you make over $400,000 a year in your taxes. Compare that to everybody under $200,000 a year getting 3 or 4% back. I think that's well worth the sacrifice, even though I understand the points that you're making. First of all, the congressional analysis that I found, it would add $1 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Is the congressional analysis that they published that I can find. There's a lot of conflicting numbers, but that is the one that they found in Congress, and therefore I will stick to that number. And you talk about the best times in the United States for when we had growth in the United States, and you said the Bill Clinton era. The Bill Clinton era, I've actually done a debate on this previously, is one of the worst areas for overall economic growth because our debt to GDP ratio significantly worsened, right, compared to what happened in the 1980s with Reagan, and it went down again in the 2000s with George W. Bush. So if, once again, historically, tax cuts, good thing. And you talk about the economy overheating, but I don't think we're to that point. Our GDP is almost static at 1% growth per year, and it has been for several years now. Our net exports at some of the worst that they've ever been in time. Our GDP to debt ratio, second worst it's ever been in the history of our country. So overall, if there's ever a time that we needed to have, one, the improvement of our debt to GDP ratio, the improvement of our net exports, and an increase in our nominal GDP, it's now. And so I think the question now comes is whether or not the tax plan efficiently tackles this issue. And if you look at any other time there's been a significant tax cut in history, the big ones in recent history, it has achieved these goals. And so it's logical to say that a similar bill proposing the same type of corporate tax rates is once again going to accomplish these goals. And I'll pass it to you after one thing. I want to ask you a question. You talk about inflation and how inflation is getting out of control. Going back to Economics 101, what does a positive shift in aggregate supply do?
So what I said is that inflation isn't out of control. Inflation is consistently being low. That is a problem, because when that is consistently low, then we're not having the buyer saver transmission, and we're also not using all of the monetary transmission mechanisms. Secondly, nominal gross domestic product, that has really little to do with your fiscal stance. That is specifically a stance of a monetary regime. So again, I don't think that that falls to you, because nominal gross domestic product growth is consistent with the money in the system and how it's growing versus prices and goods. So that is not yours. But I do want to point out something real quick, and then I'll hand it back. That 200,000, those who make roughly $200,000 and less are getting an increase of what they're not paying, right? That does not spur growth. The top 1% spurs growth. You're basing this on moving towards a growth economy, and then you keep talking about GDP to debt ratio. Why in the hell do you keep using that as a metric of somehow understanding what's good for the country versus what's bad? Because we can look at Japan, who's had an extremely high GDP to debt ratio and is consistently still at full employment. And then we look at Abenomics that are currently going on right now, which is a monetary regime with a little bit of fiscal stimulus, and it's doing well.
So I apologize for the inflation point. You were breaking up a bit, so I couldn't get together all what you're saying in the previous statement. But so a few different points. So one, you bring up a valid point, how the economy overall, our quality of life does get spurred through investors and the top 1% investing in some company or some project. And that's true, but this plan does not overly harm the people making over $420,000 a year, right? Because this is always the discussion about the relocation and relocation of wealth from the top 1% to the lower class. And if we just give all the money to the lower class and they go buy hamburgers, it doesn't really help the economy, right? But overall, the lower class is getting a rather significant tax break of a few percent, and the upper class is getting a rather insignificant tax break of just an extra 2 or 3% on average. Or, I'm sorry, a tax increase about 2 or 3% on average to them. So overall, it's not detrimental like it was in the 1970s, where the upper class being taxed 91%, and that's choking the growth. Overall, they still are able to invest money because a very minute percentage of their money is actually going to be increased. So you talk about the GDP to debt ratio, and I bring this up for a lot of reasons. And I'll talk about this because I actually don't think I ever have before. So I believe it's the best way to evaluate a country overall and how their economy is doing in comparison to their debt. So obviously nominal GDP, real GDP, and the debt themselves are not always good indicators of how an economy is overall functioning. So I believe it's the clearest window we have, generally speaking, to how we can assess these economies over time by comparing the GDP to the debt at the time, nominal GDP, that is. So to get into another part of the bill that we haven't talked about yet, it increases the child tax credit, so that single income households like yourself being a house husband, Joe, are able to get bigger deductions per child you have. Under the current law, a couple with 2 children making $60,000 a year, we did $13,000 deduction. This would increase by $4,100 for the same family under the new GOP tax bill. So not only does it help families and the lower class once again, but it also helps those single income households. Another part of it that I think we can both agree on is sports teams can no longer deduct their stadiums as public service. So just to picture how absurd this is, the government was subsidizing multi-billion-dollar industries to build sports stadiums that they would then turn and profit on and say that it was a public service. And it's just another thing that they are eliminating because it makes no logical sense, right? But even on top of that, like child tax credit, the narrowing of the tax brackets, overall, it's not overly harming the upper class, but it's going to make a significant impact to the middle and lower class. And if you look historically to where similar bills have been passed, it boomed the economy. And so I don't think it's fair to say that it's not going to do the same here.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The problems I have with the GDP to debt ratio, obviously it tells you some things, but I don't think it tells you as much as looking at bond markets. I don't think it looks as much, tells you as much as your manufacturing production. I don't think it tells you nearly as much as your real exchange rate, your real effective exchange rate. I think that's ultimately the best indicator because that tells you what your monetary policy is, that tells you what your production growth is, that tells you your standard of living in your country because it's typically held to purchasing power parity. And I think that overall is a much, much better indicator. And if we look at the United States, when it comes to that, it's already real high, which lets me know that with inflation being low, that being high, that there is an economy that's running hot because we're having low employment and low inflation, that there's and the way the bond markets are not moving, saying that there's not any significant supply side changes, because supply side is what causes growth. That's what I was talking about, which leads me to my next point, is that you're saying that it doesn't overly harm them. That's true, but they're already overly harmed. This top 1% is already overtaxed. They pay for 70%, roughly speaking, of the taxes in the United States. That needs to come down, and the middle class and the lower class need to pull themselves up. And that's based on the Laffer curve from the Harvard study that I stated earlier. Next, child tax credits. Yes, I get that, and that does seem good. However, there is a problem with this. If the child tax credit specifically targeted married couples to incentivize married couples to have children, I would agree. But this tax credit goes to single mothers as well, fathers, which only further incentivizes the breakup of the nuclear family. If we want to use the tax system to incentivize something, we need to incentivize marriage. We need to incentivize two-parent homes, because the moment we start incentivizing these single-parent homes, we are not going to have a significant change in the social dynamics that are causing these massive problems with crime in the United States. And it also does not help against the relative income inequality that I stated earlier. Next, stadiums. Sure, agreed. That's a good thing. That doesn't necessarily need to be put into a tax bill. That could have been a law separate from itself, so I'm going to co-opt that. Which a lot of the good things are easily co-opted into something without actually having to narrow the tax code and not significantly reduce the taxes to the top 1% and keeping growth down. And then next, I just overall, there's not enough from this tax plan that I think that significantly spurs growth, and that it doesn't actually fix any of the problems with the tax code itself, which is something the Republicans and Donald Trump should have done. And until they do that, I do not agree with this tax plan.
Okay, so the few you bring up, once again, the GDP to debt ratio. So I understand you have some other good indicators, but overall, I normally choose to cite the GDP to debt ratio because how effectively it resembles the effectiveness of fiscal policy from the government and monetary policy at that example, and how effective it is at tackling the debt or increasing GDP, because I think one of the two indicators by themselves is rather misleading. And so you talk about how the upper percent is already overtaxed, and that's somewhat true, that they're already overtaxed. I'll concede to, because we do have the highest progressive tax system in the entire world. But overall, like, overtaxed an extra 2% to your taxes is not going to be a dramatic increase to Bill Gates, right? And I do think that the upper class should get a tax break, and that's one of the few problems that I do have with this bill, is it's increasing taxes on the upper class. But overall, the increase is rather insignificant, so I don't think that warrants the entire disregard of the bill itself. Another point incentivize two-parent households. And I think this is fair. I think obviously two-parent households are better for society and superior, but I don't think it's fair to cut single-income households. You know, your husband dies in a car crash. Should you stop receiving the same tax credit? Or if your husband cheats on you and leaves you, should you stop receiving the same tax credit? No, of course not. It's immoral. Now, there are problems with it. It's not a perfect system, but it's what we have to do to be fair to everyone in all these given situations. And the stadiums, it could be part of an adjacent bill. That's true. I mean, you can say that about basically anything in any large bill, that it could be part of separate bills. But it's just how it is, and that's overall a good thing. Like we said, that they stopped the subsidizing the public services through stadiums. So, and another thing we haven't talked about is how it repeals the Obama mandate. As I live and breathe and speak to you right now, Joe, I do not have health care. If a meteor fell and hit me and broke like all my legs, I'm done, right? But this is important, because it is a violation of freedom to force people to buy healthcare, right? Because it's for a few reasons. One, it hurts those that are in poor situations. If you can't afford healthcare, especially now that Obamacare is going through the roof, if you can't afford healthcare and you just get fined again, you're done. And also people that are in good health. If I have six-pack abs and I eat my apples every day, I shouldn't be forced to buy healthcare, and I should be able to have the choice to just pay to go to the doctor, especially when most basic healthcare plans don't even involve stuff like cancer or the extremes that people like to go to when they talk about the Obama mandate. So previously, I was paying $500 a month for healthcare that wouldn't even cover if I got a terminal illness. So overall, I think you should have that freedom, and repealing the Obama mandate, which is once again part of this bill, is an excellent decision.
All right, so we're going to talk about the last bit of this. Next is overly harmed. You've already succeeded that they're already overly harmed. 2%, 2 to 3% is insignificant. If they're already overharmed, we're only compounding the problem that they have. And I think that once you concede that there's a problem, you cannot, by virtue of logic, consider that the problem is insignificant as it increases. I don't think that that's good logic. Next is you talk about that the debt to GDP is still the best thing. It's not. It doesn't tell you really anything, because the way debt works within the monetary system, it can fluctuate. It depends on whether or not that the Federal Reserve is willing to buy up debt. I mean, because last I checked, the Federal Reserve was talking about buying up $4 trillion worth of debt. That way that it can stop crowding out the interest rates. But that's not a good enough significant other indicators. I mean, really, if we're going into economic indicators, Case-Shiller index is really good. Real purchasing power and exchange rates, strict GDP, all of those are better indicators than GDP to debt ratio. Next, tax credits for the single parent family, right? So there's already a mechanism in place that takes care of that. It does not need to increase with the dual parent family increase, right? So we can still say that they get extra money for a child tax credit. They just do not get the same increase that two parent families get, because that still incentivizes. We want to create some level of incentivizing that removes people from wanting to have the single parent families. Obviously, if you're married and your husband dies and things of that nature, there should be some mechanism in there, but I don't think as an aggregate it is a good choice. And I don't think that it's unfair to give people who are married more money than people who aren't married, because we're trying to spur growth and we're trying to change society in a better format. And I think overall that's the goal. Last, healthcare, right? Even if I buy your argument that this is good, which I don't necessarily disagree with it, the problem is this is just a failure of Donald Trump and the Republicans to overall repeal the Affordable Health Care Act. And this is them trying to do some type of saving grace. It would have been much better if they would have just done the full health care bill rather than slapping it in without any concern to what's going to happen to the market as is. So I don't think that that's a net positive. In fact, I think it's a net negative, because when you remove that, the way the healthcare system is set up right now, it will cause an even more increase in prices. And so I think at the end of the day, it's not a
okay. So a few of the points. First one, the 2 to 3% is not insignificant. So I'm not sure what the current 1% progressive tax rate is. I'm sure I could look it up. I won't bother. But anyway, like 2 to 3% of your multi-billions of dollars or your multi-millions of dollars is rather insignificant. I think there should be tax cuts, but I'm not going to say increasing the tax on the wealthy by 2% is going to be enough to warrant tossing out this entire bill and the economic opportunities and then the issues that it gets rid of course. You talk about the two parent families, and I agree. Two parent families are a good thing. I absolutely agree with you on that, and I think there maybe should be some incentive, but it's not fair to strike down single parents if they have sudden tragedy or sudden loss. Obviously, we both know statistically and factually speaking, the kids that have two parents when they're growing up is always going to end up better. But that's not always the case, right? That's like I didn't grow up with two families, or two parents my entire life, and therefore it's not fair to punish a single individual and say, oh, well, now you lost the second income into your family, so guess what? You're going to get less money in taxes. Like, that's not logical. And then you talk about the Obama mandate and how it fails to. It's just a failure to appeal the Affordable Health Care Act. Well, they have struggled with this for some time. That's a fault of the Trump administration. I don't think it's a fault of the Trump's tax plan that they failed to appeal the Affordable Health Care Act. But even so, the House passed their appeal for the Affordable Health Care Act a long time. I think they passed it back in like February. Compare that to the Senate that wanted to put it as part of the tax bill, and then Paul Ryan reactively decided to incorporate it into the tax bill. So I'm going to pass it back to you and see what you have to say to
that. Really, I'm just going to use up my last 3 minutes here and do my final speech. So first and foremost, let's talk about this overall. Trump's tax plan does not significantly spur growth. It's less than 0.7% over the 10-year period. That same period, the deficit just on the tax plan by $1 trillion, but overall $10 trillion in the decade, right? So that's back to that congressional. I think you should have read that a little bit more because it's just from the tax cut that adds another $1.5 trillion, but overall it's still $10 trillion. Next, the lowest corporate tax rate, it lands in the middle, which is not going to spur growth because it's not bringing anything back, and obviously we want to bring back, and it doesn't significantly change the tax laws for goods going in and out of the United States, which is what you want to change exports and imports. Next, that the debt here is going to be a bigger stimulus against growth than it will be for growth because it is crowding out interest rates and it's hurting the economy overall, especially as we're getting ready to move towards a recession. And I would say that sometime within the next 3 to 4 years, because the economy is running hot and the business cycle is starting to reset itself again. And then next, that it doesn't significantly change the tax bracket to the top 1%. Therefore, it's not spurring any growth from that, and it's actually raising it. And again, we go back to that 2 to 3% is insignificant. 2 to 3% is the difference on savings from high-level countries to low-level countries. And you talked about China and the U.S., how they have a catch-up effect, but they've still managed to outsave and out-invest in the United States. That is a problem that is spurred on by our high tax system, that to the top 1% that is not being addressed by this tax bill. And then we talked about the child tax credits. I think we both agree that we should incentivize two-parent families versus one-parent families. I think you're misdirecting what I'm trying to say, and by using the word punish, I'm not punishing them. What I'm saying is that the mechanism that's in place currently can still stay with them. They will still get child tax credits. They just do not need to have the same incentive as two-parent families. And again, I said, if a mother or a father loses someone with them, I think that there should be a mechanism in place to help that, but I do not think that is the same as giving everyone the same tax break. And then lastly, the healthcare. I think you missed again some of the arguments that I made is that, yes, I want to get rid of ACA. Yes, I think getting rid of the mandate's a good idea. No, I don't think it was good in this bill because there is not a significant other side of the bill that fixes the other problems in the Healthcare Act. And as long as you have those problems and you get rid of the mandate at the same time, it will only cause prices to go up. That is why everyone should vote for the con.
Okay. So I only have seconds, so I'll just basically sum it up. So overall, lowering the corporate tax rate every other time in history that we've had significant lowers to the corporate tax rate, debt to GDP increase, debt to GDP improve, net exports improve, which is something we both need because they're at some of their worst points in history. Narrowing of the tax bracket is going to help the middle class, which we can all say is a good thing. Thank you, Joe. It's been a lot of fun.